Hey everyone, welcome to Keto and Crime and Thought Crime. Today, 𝗠𝗂𝗋 continues with my review breakdown of my top 3 Universal Studios monster movies. So I'm going to break these down for you, going to give you some interesting background information and just talk about them and have some fun. So, without further ado, let's get started, but first I want to give a shout out to my patrons and my channel members. Thank you so much. And also, if you are new to the channel, please consider subscribing or joining down below. You can do that. Or just watch, like, comment, share, subscribe. That is the best thing you can do for the channel. You can also join my patrons, link down below. And it just helps me be able to buy the things that I need to do to help this channel. So, to grow this channel. So, I hope you're all enjoying it. Kind of sad to see 𝗠𝗂𝗋 start to wind up and come to an end, but the next 2 weekends are going to be fun. And then we will get back into our normal true crime / history / books related to those subjects in November. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Universal Monsters. What was the Universal Monster franchise? Well, it was literally the very first cinematic universe. Today we are so used to movies that build off of each other, and there's entire universes in which these movies move, the characters are interrelated. You know, probably the most the most modern one that goes the furthest back for our generations would probably be Star Wars. Star Wars is definitely a cinematic universe. It goes even into an expanded universe of comic books and things like that. So Star Wars would be probably, in my opinion, the second cinematic universe. You know, today we're so used to Marvel. That's definitely the most well-recognized universe, and you know, DC, they try. But Universal Monsters was the very first. This was the first string of movies where all the characters were interrelated, and they kind of went in the same timeline, same time zone, not time zone, but timeline and the same universe, where you knew that they all existed and the people in the movies knew that they existed. And it started back in 1925 with Lon Chaney Sr. playing the Phantom of the Opera. This was a silent movie. It was not a talkie. That did not develop until the early 30s, but it was the Universal Monsters that helped bring that in. And Lon Chaney Sr. as the Phantom of the Opera, the old one where you see the woman sneak up and pull the mask off his face. I will drop clips. That is the original Universal Monster, and this would actually be recreated as a talkie in 1940 starring Claude Rains, who was the Invisible Man and also played in several other of the monster movies. That's another thing that the Universal movies started off, is in cinematic universes using the same actors to play the same characters or even other characters in the franchise. Universal Monsters was the first. You will see a commonality of actors as we go through some of these movies. And some of the big ones were Lon Chaney Sr., his son Lon Chaney Jr., you had Claude Rains, you had Bela Lugosi. You had a lot of different actors playing these same monsters. And no, I didn't forget 𝗵𝗁 Karloff. 𝗵𝗁 Karloff is probably the most well-known of the Universal Monster actors. He would be the... who's the most well-known Marvel actor? He would be the Robert Downey Jr. of the Universal cinematic universe, with, you know, Bela Lugosi following up as maybe a Chris Pratt or a Chris Evans type, and then you have the others. Lon Chaney Sr. was only in the one movie, so, you know, he was kind of like a, I don't know, maybe he would kind of be like Terrence Howard, you know, who kind of left the Iron Man franchise. And then after that, you would have, like, you know, the others. They all had their popularity within the cinematic universe, with 𝗵𝗁 Karloff being the Robert Downey Jr. for sure. All right. So after the success of the Phantom of the Opera, they went on to do many other different monster movies that all interrelated. There was, of course, one of the most famous, which is one of the ones I'm going to do today, 1931's Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. In 1931, followed by 𝗵𝗁 Karloff and Frankenstein in that same year. And then, of course, in 1932, you had The Mummy. Then you had the iconic Bride of Frankenstein, in which the bride was only seen for a couple of minutes. And then you had Dracula's Daughter in 1936, Werewolf of London, 1935, Son of Frankenstein, and all the way up into the 40s, where you had The Wolf Man, which is one of the ones I'm going to cover today, and then the Phantom of the Opera remake. And somewhere in the 30s, they also shoved The Invisible Man in there with Claude Rains. And then in the 40s, you had The Ghost of Frankenstein, Frankenstein meets the Wolf Man, you had Son of Dracula, you had The Mummy's Hand, all of these sequels to The Mummy that weren't actually sequels. We'll talk about that. All the way up into 1945, where it was all capped off with House of Dracula. And then we get into the crossovers with the most famous comedic talent of the 1940s, Abbott and Costello, with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, Abbott and Costello Meet the Wolf Man. And that pretty much closed out the Universal Monsters. And the reason being that the United States had just come out of the Great Depression, as well as World War II. They still wanted their Universal Monsters, but they didn't want them so scary. So they added Abbott and Costello to those. And so the Abbott and Costello movies, I kind of put them in the same league with, like, Guardians of the Galaxy, even though they were great movies. They had a more comedic side. So to me, that would be kind of the most unique comparison. But of all the Universal Monsters, I have seen all the movies, and I like them all. But 3 rise to the top for me. And that is one of the originals, 1931's Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, would be my number 3 favorite. Number 2 is going to be 1931's The Mummy, which is just unique for a lot of different reasons. And then finally, my very favorite Universal monster is 1941's The Wolf Man. And we're going to talk about all of those today. So let's get into it. We'll start with the number 3 countdown, Dracula. And I know some Universal Monster purists are like, Tracy, Dracula was a cinematic powerhouse. Why isn't that your favorite? Well, just because I think the Wolfman and the Mummy are better. Those stories speak to me. Just because, you know, something is great doesn't necessarily mean it's great for you. So if you are not a horror fan, I still highly recommend you watch the Universal Monsters. By today's standards, though they are still scary, they're not super gory. And it's not going to give you nightmares. So if you have never seen or not a fan of horror movies, still check out the Universal Monsters. My first exposure to these were actually through books. When I was a kid in our elementary school library, they had a whole selection of picture books that were related to the Universal Monsters, and I kept those things checked out a lot. I just like looking at the pictures, the black and white photos, reading about the stars, that kind of thing. And those were my first experience. And then when I was a kid, I lived in the South in Alabama, and in the 70s and 80s, every region had its own Saturday morning or late Friday night horror show. And for me, that was on Saturday mornings with Super Scary Saturday on Turner Broadcast Systems on TBS, the old TBS. And it was hosted by Grandpa from the Munsters. And it was through those shows that I first saw the Universal Monsters. I first saw movies like Willard and Ben and even the Planet of the Apes. And I would never miss an episode of those. You know, even when we got our very first VCR in like 1984, I was the kid, that learned how to program it. I would record them so that I would never miss, because I was really enthralled with horror movies, and then my love just built. So I have a huge love for these Universal Monsters. I think they are some of the best movies out there. And so let's get into Dracula. I think one of the best things about Dracula. Oh, before I get too far, let me know what your regional horror show. If you're Gen X or even a baby boomer or even an older millennial, tell me if you had one of those regional horror films. Tell me what network you watched it on and who hosted it, because there's a lot. There's there was Elvira, there was Joe Bob Briggs, there was, of course, Grandpa, Super Scary Saturday. So
the splattered baboon scene from The Fly. But you think that's gross? Well, you see what's coming up later. These may be some of the greatest drive-in makeup effects in history in this movie. This movie was directed by the Canadian David Cronenberg, who kind of specializes in 𝗙𝗪𝗍𝗍. He made that movie The Brood.
Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. I'd like to be able to carve a swell jack-o'-lantern, but I just don't seem to have the knack. Well, these are a few pointers on the fine art of creating the perfect jack-o'-lantern. Rule number 1, you want to start out with a pumpkin.
Hello. It's me, Grandpa, and welcome to another monstrous edition of Super Scary Saturday. Yeah, come on down. Don't be scared. Come on and join me in my screaming room.
Let me know what you watched as a kid. But let's talk about Dracula. As I said, it's one of the greatest cinematic achievements because it was one of the first talkies, the first movies with sound, and definitely striving for new territory with scary movies. What I really love about this movie is the gothic scenery. It really was dark and dreary, and when you watch this movie, you can actually, in my opinion, almost reach out and touch the mist. I mean, it is really well done for its time period. And also, it stayed pretty loyal to the original source material. There are differences between Bram Stoker's original novel, Dracula, and this movie. But to really research what Dracula was, I'm going to recommend a video I've already done on the origins of Dracula. He was actually based on 2 real-life historical figures. So this movie opens with an Englishman by the name of Renfield, played by Dwight Frye. Now, of all the performances in this movie, Dwight's performance as Renfield is my favorite. He is definitely the epitome of an insane vampiric slave. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to drop some clips of him here. But he's traveling from England to the Carpathia area in Transylvania, and he's going to meet a count by the name of Dracula that has leased Carfax Abbey in England and will be living there for a time. So he's on his way to get the deed signed, finish the transaction, and I'm sure get his commission because he's probably the one that's brokered this deal. So we open with several people, including Renfield, in a carriage speeding very fast through the countryside of Transylvania toward a small town. When they get there, the other townspeople disboard, go into the inn where Renfield says, no, I paid the driver. I need to go meet a carriage at 𝗿𝗂𝐽 Pass, which is a very creepy mountainous pass in the Carpathian Mountains in Transylvania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, that area, Eastern Europe. And he needs to meet a carriage. Well, there's a young gypsy man down there that says, hey, whose carriage is picking you up? And they tell him Count Dracula. Well, all these people just visibly freak out, and they tell him, please don't go to there. That the dude's a vampire. And of course, Renfield thinks they're crazy, and he tells the driver he needs to go. So there we go. And then we cut to Dracula's very decrepit looking castle, at least the outside of it's kind of webby and fallen apart, to 4 coffins. One of them opens. We get the first sight of Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula, and then he also has 3 vampire wives that come out of their coffins. And he disguises himself as a carriage driver. He gets on his own carriage with his own horses, and I'm not sure who takes care of these horses, but he takes off to meet Renfield at this 𝗿𝗂𝐽 Pass. Well, we cut to Renfield, and this carriage that's carrying him is driving like a bat out of hell, y'all. He is driving. He doesn't really even stop. He does a rolling stop like I sometimes do at stop signs. And pretty much Renfield has to jump out, and the guy just tosses his 2 bags off the carriage at him and keeps going. There's no way this guy's going to stop and come into any contact with Count Dracula or anybody else that might be in the mountains. But anyway, so Renfield gets up, picks up his bag and his briefcase, and looks at this incredibly creepy driver that is sitting, obviously Count Dracula, but he hasn't seen Dracula yet, so how would he know? And so he hands his bags to this guy, who just generally puts them in his lap. He doesn't really put them on top of the carriage or anything, and so Renfield gets in the carriage and they take off. They get closer to Dracula's castle, and Renfield asks the driver a question who does not answer. And then he looks out the window and notices the driver is gone. His bags are sitting on the driver's seat, and there's a giant bat flying over the horses as if it's controlling the horses. Now, y'all, my ass would be out of that carriage so fast. I would have jumped. I'd probably left my baggage, and I would have ran. There would have been no way that I'm driving a Batmobile into this creepy castle. But anyway, he gets there. We get to the carriage stops. Renfield jumps out. The carriage takes back off, and then he goes into the castle, which is kind of creepy and dank. And then we get our first huge vision of Count Dracula himself walking down the steps. Renfield is kind of taken aback.
I am Dracula. Oh, it's really good to see you. I don't know what happened to the driver and my luggage, and with all this, I thought I was in the wrong place. I bid you welcome. Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
But he doesn't really say anything. Dracula takes him into the inner sanctum of the castle, which is much warm and cheery. Takes him up to a guest room where he has dinner there for him. And wonderful roaring fire. Now, the thing of it is, in the novel by Bram Stoker, again, check out those two films those two videos I did that tell you the origins of Count Dracula, which were two real-life historical figures, Vlad the Impaler and Catherine with Bathory, the Blood Countess, were actually two real-life historical figures that were the origins of Dracula. And so Dracula takes him in, they have a conversation. Dracula looks over the deed because somehow his luggage had mysteriously appeared in the bedroom. Dracula said, "Oh, I had them brought up." And then Dracula pulls out this bottle that looks like red wine and pours Renfield a cup. He said, "This is wonderful. Aren't you going to have some?" And he goes, "No, I don't drink wine," in the most creepy way that you could say those words. So anyway, Dracula leaves him to sleep. Renfield kind of gets spooked, and he kind of starts looking around the room, wondering what's going on. From off camera, you see Dracula's wives start to shanter into the bedroom. And then you see Renfield go to the huge balcony door and open it, I guess, to get some air. And then you see this huge, obviously on strings, bat fly over, and Renfield just passes out from fright. And then you see both Dracula and his wives start to close in on him. Dracula gets rid of the wives, and he attacks Renfield. You don't see it, but you know it's happened. And then we cut to a boat, because during the conversation he told Renfield that he had chartered a ship to take him and his luggage to England. And they're on the ship, and Renfield is a raving lunatic. He's sitting next to Count Dracula, calling him master. He's surviving by eating insects, and he's just a nutcase. And Dwight Frye does a brilliant job playing Renfield. So,
we are here. You can't hear what I'm saying, but we are here. We are safe.
We cut to a scene of Renfield going up and looking at this boat, which is a schooner named the 𝗏esta, that is in the middle of a storm. And you have all the men just kind of thrown about, by the storm, and he's watching the crew work. He goes back downstairs and tells Dracula, "Oh, it's nighttime, master." So Dracula goes up and looks, and then we cut to images of a newspaper in England, as well as conversation surrounding, I guess that happened on the dock, when the 𝗏esta docked. They were talking about how the entire crew was dead. They only found the cargo and one raving lunatic by the name of Renfield.
Why, he's mad. Look at his eyes. Why, the man's gone crazy.
In the bottom of the boat. So Renfield is transferred to an asylum owned by Dr. John Stewart, who we will meet. And Dracula, after he's in his coffin, after his coffin is unloaded, it's actually taken to Carfax Abbey, where it was destined for. They still send the cargo where it's supposed to go, and Renfield's now in an asylum, and Dracula goes to Carfax Abbey. He then takes a moment that evening to go out and walk the streets of London, where we see him hypnotize, attack, and drain a young lady selling flowers on the street. And then he enters a theater where a opera is going on, and there he hypnotizes the ticket taker and the usher to give him an introduction to the family of Dr. John Stewart, who owns the sanitarium and asylum where Renfield is now. And he also happens to be the one that owns the house across from Carfax Abbey. So he meets Dr. Stewart, he meets his daughter Mina, and her fiancé John Harker, who in the novel, Bram Stoker's Dracula, was the one that actually met Dracula in Transylvania. So And they also meet Mina's best friend, Lucy Weston. And Lucy is absolutely enthralled by Count Dracula, if you take a look at these still shots. Now, guys, my one beef with this movie is how all movies you have to suspend your belief a little bit, but look at how flush and drawn out Dracula was. I mean, really. If anything, this dude's anemic. I don't understand why no one thought maybe this dude needs medical attention, why Dr. Seward is not even asking him if he feels all right. But anyway, so Lucy is absolutely enthralled. They quote some poetry to each other. And then we cut to Lucy spending the night with Mina and her kind of in a hypnotic trance, walking out to meet Count Dracula in the yard. And Dracula obviously, does the thing. And then we cut to a scene at Dr. Seward's asylum where they're doing medical procedures on Lucy with blood transfusions, trying to bring her back from the brink of death, because in the novel, she's actually drained over a matter of days by Count Dracula. He doesn't kill her right away. He just drains her for days, and she gets pale and anemic, and they give her blood transfusions. So, in the movie, Lucy Weston is just a friend of Mina Seward, who is engaged to Jonathan Harker. Now, in the book, Lucy is engaged to Jonathan Harker and is also the sister of another gentleman that is not in the movie by the name of Arthur Holmwood. And Arthur Holmwood is in love with Mina, but in the movie, as it often is, it's changed. So we have Jonathan's engaged to Mina instead of Lucy. But in the novel, Lucy is drained systematically over several days, ends up dying, and then coming back as a vampire. And her fiancé, Jonathan Harker, has to do the stake through the heart and put her out of her misery. And then we watch as Mina, same thing kind of happens to Mina as Arthur Holmwood and Jonathan Harker try to save her. But in the movie, it's simply Lucy just is dead. They can't save her. She's gone. She's dead. We don't even get to see that story. So I don't know if that was left out for lack of funds. I mean, they did this movie for just over $300,000, but that's a lot of money in the 30s. And I'm sure for sake of time, all of these movies, including Dracula, only about an hour and 15 minutes long. So they're not heavy on dialogue. They're not heavy on really anything. So much went into the special effects. So anyway, that Arthur Holmwood was totally left out of this movie. But so Lucy's dead, just like that. And then we cut to an office where Dr. Seward is telling his guest, another doctor by the name of Van Helsing. So, Van Helsing is actually telling Dr. Seward, and Van Helsing is brilliantly portrayed by Edward Van Sloan, who would appear in many of these movies as kind of the hero. And so he became like the first superhero, in my opinion. But he is telling, and Van Helsing was not always the hero. But this actor would portray the hero. So that's how he kind of got typecast. So anyway, he's telling him, because he is from the Transylvania, Eastern European region, telling him about vampires and how Lucy had two very distinct little holes in her neck, and he suspects a vampire. But of course, Dr. Seward, being a man of science, doesn't really believe him and just kind of dismisses him. Now, meanwhile, we cut to Renfield in the asylum, who's his orderly, who is this. The scenes between him and his orderly are hilarious. The orderly is very definitely a Scotsman who is telling him he's crazy as shit, and that he takes the insects away from him that Renfield's trying to eat, and Renfield's begging for the spider, and it's just one of the most hilarious scenes. But basically,
he probably wants this Martin! No, Martin! Oh, Martin, please! Here, give it to me now. No, Martin, please. No, Martin. Martin, don't throw my spider away from me. Oh, Martin. Oh. Ain't you ashamed now? Ain't you? Spiders now, is it? Flies ain't good enough. Flies? Flies? Poor, puny things. Who wants to eat flies? You do, you loony. Not when I can get nice, fat spiders.
So we cut to him, and then we cut to a scene of a wolf howling, because as 𝗏𝗏𝗁 explained to 𝗟𝗏𝗽, that one of the hallmarks of a vampire is that they can transform into bats and wolves. And so this wolf is howling, and of course 𝗟𝗏𝗽's like, a wolf near London? That's impossible. But yet Renfield is having a telepathic conversation with this wolf. And of course, they bring Renfield down to talk to 𝗟𝗏𝗽. They determine that he's crazy, of course. And then the orderly takes him back. And then we cut to the 𝗟𝗏𝗽 house, which, remember, is across from Carfax Abbey. They are literally Dracula's neighbors, in which Van Helsing, Jonathan Harker, and Mina are sitting there. And Van Helsing and 𝗟𝗏𝗽 are having a conversation about the plant wolfsbane, which is a flower that will appear in many of the Universal Monster movies, particularly in The Wolfman, that has supernatural powers, and it's kind of the cure-all for most of these monsters. So he's telling him how, you can, because of what happened to Lucy, he might need to protect other people in the house with this wolfbane. But of course, 𝗟𝗏𝗽, being a man of science, doesn't really believe it. And then we cut to Mina's bedroom, because I guess another night has passed. And we see Dracula come in, and it cuts right before Dracula does the thing. So now he's starting to systematically drain Mina. Then we cut to the living room where 𝗟𝗏𝗽, Van Helsing, and Jonathan Harker, as well as Mina, are sitting. And all of a sudden, Count Dracula just appears. The maid comes in and says, hey, Count Dracula's here to visit. They bring him in. Van Helsing gets a shiver as soon as he sees Count Dracula, because he's the only one that realizes that this man needs a blood transfusion because he's anemic. Sees him and immediately knows this dude's a vampire. Something's wrong. And so he tries to tell Harker that something's wrong while Count Dracula carries on a conversation with Mina, a very creepy conversation, but Mina excuses herself and goes to bed. And then the three gentlemen are still there talking with Dracula. Now, the funniest part of this movie is Van Helsing has a mirror that's in a little, kind of like a little music box with a mirror on top. Not really a music box, but a box. And Dracula walks up to him, and Van Helsing wastes no time. He just says, I know what you are. And almost like he just opens it and shows Dracula the mirror, and Dracula freaks out because, of course, there's no reflection. Jonathan Harker sees it too. And Dracula just flips out and knocks the mirror from Van Helsing's hand. It's almost as if Van Helsing goes, bitch, I know you're a vampire. And just like that.
I'm sorry, Doctor. My visit was so ill-timed.
Not at all. On the contrary, it may prove to be most enlightening. In fact, before you go, you can be of definite service.
Anything I can do, gladly.
A moment ago, I stumbled upon a most amazing phenomenon. Something so incredible, I mistrust my own judgment. Look.
And so Dracula excuses himself, tells Dr. 𝗟𝗏𝗽 he just doesn't like mirrors, and they leave. And he leaves. But basically, Van Helsing and Harker now know something is wrong. So we now cut to another night where they have tied wolfsbane all around Mina's bedroom in an attempt to keep her from being drained and killed like Lucy. Then we cut to the living room. Like I said, this movie jumps around a lot, and I'm not sure if it was the filmmaking style or whatever, but it really does jump around. Anyhow, so we cut to a living room where Van Helsing and Dracula are having a conversation, and Dracula attempts to hypnotize Van Helsing because he knows the jig is up. Van Helsing knows he's a vampire, but Van Helsing is immune to I believe it's called glimmering in some of the later vampire franchises, but he is completely immune to it. He has such self-control over his mind. And then he pulls out a cross, and Dracula just flips out, turns into a bat, and flies off. And then we cut to the bedroom where Dracula's hypnotized Briggs, the maid, to open the windows, remove the wolfsbane, and so he hypnotizes Mina. And then Jonathan Harker, who is decided he needs to take Mina away from here, goes up to try to convince her to leave with him, and they're sitting on the balcony, and Mina is talking about how much she loves night and bats and fog and just really weird, and then this bat appears over the balcony and is talking to Mina telepathically and basically tells her to attack Harker, which she tries, but of course she's pretty easy to fend off, and then they put her back to bed, but then Dracula comes in and kidnaps her and takes her to Carfax Abbey. Meanwhile, Renfield has escaped from the asylum, and he was the one that allowed Dracula to gain access to the house by opening the window for him. And so he's going to Carfax Abbey to meet up with his master. When he gets there, he is taking Mina up the stairs. Dracula's taking Mina up the stairs to finish transforming her into a vampire, put her into the coffin that's filled with Transylvanian dirt so that her transformation is complete. Renfield gets there, but unbeknownst to him, Jonathan Harker and Van Helsing have followed him. And Dracula's pretty angry at Renfield, so we see Dracula kill Renfield, even though Renfield is begging for mercy. And then they chase Dracula, but Dracula gets away, goes into the inner sanctum of the castle, locks them out. They manage to break through. They get into where there are two coffins. They open one coffin, and there's Dracula asleep in whatever trance they go into because it's getting near morning. And so Van Helsing says to Harker, you need to find me a rock so that I can drive the stake through his heart. So he helps Van Helsing find a rock that he can drive a stake through his heart, and then he opens the other coffin expecting to see Mina there, but it's empty. So he says maybe she's not fully transformed, and he runs around looking for her and finally finds her, and she's in kind of this half-human, half-vampire stupor. And she tells him that she heard him calling and got up and tried to find him. Meanwhile, off camera, we hear the first strikes of Van Helsing on the stake, and we hear Dracula call out. But we never see Dracula again, so it is assumed that Dracula has been staked and is no longer alive. After Dracula calls out and is obviously dead, Nina returns back to fully human. And, blood does, the heart will make more blood, the body will make more blood, so she'll be okay. And then the three go to try to find a way out. They get to the way out, and Van Helsing tells them to leave him. He has some stuff he has to finish up, and it just ends. We don't know what happened to Van Helsing. Now, of course, there were sequels to Dracula, which would later on say that Van Helsing had gone back to actually cut off Dracula's head and stuff his mouth with wolfsbane, because that's the prescription for keeping vampires dead, and then was attacked by Dracula, who wasn't fully dead, and then that leads into some of the other movies, but we don't see that. The movie just ends. And that's how the original Dracula ends. I think it's a very good movie for its time. I mean, if you're trying to compare it to today's movies, you will be disappointed, but it's a great classic look at how horror films with practical effects were done. And that's why it's my number 3 favorite Universal horror movie. And with that, I'm going to end episode 1. I will be back tomorrow with The Mummy and possibly The Wolfman But until then, 𝐤𝐡𝐞𝐽.